Mélissa Mars is a material architect. She graduated from HED in 2013 and went on to complete her master's degree in conservation of the built environment at the University of Montreal. She is working now for EVOQ, I hope that's correct, architecture in Montreal in Canada. So she's joining us from a morning in Canada. So good morning to Mélissa. Her talk today is titled Making Real, Making Proud, From Media to Mediation in the Conservation of Historic Interiors in America. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you for this introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I will share my screen. Okay. Is it fine?
Can't see anything quite yet on my side. It says you started screen sharing, so hopefully it's coming up. There it is. Now it's there. Great.
Yeah? Okay, good. Well, okay, let's the beginning. As I first studied at the HED before continuing the fight of heritage conservation in Canada as an interior architect, I will talk exclusively about my professional passion, so historic interiors from the conservation to the enhancement. In our image-dominated societies, communication tools, including new technologies, intrude daily into our lives and practices. This is also the case with the conservation of built heritage. These tools allow us to transcribe, document, understand, and communicate in order to act as custodians, mediators, and influencers. While improving our practices, they are, however, catalyzing some controversial trends, such as digital archiving and the destruction of material components. Being less accessible than public spaces and more vulnerable to change, this is especially true of historic interiors. These lectures aim to demonstrate the fundamental need to change our paradigms regards to the conservation of historic interiors, as well as the renewed use of the media. In order to do so, I will present you to the context in which the conservation of built heritage is conducted in Quebec, as it is directly linked to our perception of historic interiors and ways to manage them. The province of Quebec is mainly developed on both sides of the St. Lawrence River, which is a major communication axis and the backbone of the Northern Territory. Quebec covers more than 1.5 million square kilometers, 3 times the area of France and 38 times that of Switzerland. There are 2 major cities, Montreal and Quebec. Formerly a French and then an English colony, Quebec has long drawn on these 2 strong antagonisms, influencing its identity and its built heritage. In fact, the decades following the British conquest in 1759 were marked by tensions between English-speaking communities, mostly made of wealthy leaders, and French-speaking community, mostly made of humble farmers and factory workers, widening the gap between these 2 solitudes. Quebec asserted its autonomy and its own identity from the rest of the country, particularly from the 60s through a series of political and social endeavors, not without rebellious. Simultaneously, Quebecers radically distanced themselves from the Catholic Church, which had up until then a considerable influence, as was the case in many colonies of the Americas. This fact leaves a big corpus of religious architecture left to the weather and the times. Today, the question arises, with all of these identity splits, who cares, who takes care of what? Tensions remain. Quebec also faces several challenges with regard to heritage conservation. It's built heritage that can be considered as relatively recent, since the vast majority of these buildings date from the 18th and 19th centuries, unlike France and Switzerland, with both count more than 47,000 cultural properties of national significance from antiquity to the 60s. The weather is also an issue. The weather conditions are very harsh, and that puts building constantly to the test and requires perpetual investments in maintenance. The province of Quebec is subject to brutal changes, especially winters that last 6 to 8 months. The winter is characterized by snowstorms, extreme cold temperatures, and rapid freeze and freeze cycles. It is during these seasons that de-icing salts are extensively used, attacking metal, building foundation, and interior finishes, especially in entrance walls. Weather conditions in France and Switzerland tend to be much more constant and milder. Its rapid modernization and urbanization is another issue from the 60s to the 80s, which, as in many cities around the world, left deep scars on the pre-existing urban fabric. The never-ending demolition of significant houses, churches and convents, also the never-ending, the reign of facadism as a quick fix solution to allow demolition and development, and the real estate speculation. In order to proceed, you should be aware that in Quebec, the heritage conservation is done through value-based management. Heritage is a social and cultural construction, so there is no heritage practices without subjectiveness. From this perspective, the ultimate goal of conservation is not to keep the materiality of cultural properties for its own sake, but rather to preserve the evocative potential to ensure that the latter will be read, perceived, and interpreted in a more open meaning manner by future generations. In Quebec, values are identified and validated by a group of individuals, combining experts and citizens, then illustrated through physical components that will constitute essential references for planning any conservation or alteration intervention. The role of citizens is major in the conservation of built heritage, as shown in the example of the Saint-Sulpice Library in Montreal. Built in 1912 and designated in 1998 for both its enveloped and its interior components, including table lamps, the library was sold by the Ministère de la Culture in 2016. Having lost its purpose following the construction of a more modern and larger building, the library was unoccupied since 2004. Criticized by its citizens and professionals alike and exposed in the media, this sale was stopped. Reminded of its responsibility as a role model, the department finally remained the owner of the building and is currently working on its rehabilitation. But what does an historic interior mean? Based on my own experience, we could define it as a subtle combination of static and movable components. An interior can be landmarked as heritage based on a specific value or a set of values. But it should be noted, however, that a universal and constant quality is also required. A historic interior must include both sensitive and emotional components and didactic intellectual components so that its interest is perceived, understood, and recognized by its user. In North America, the acknowledgement of interiors gained ground in the 80s and 90s, particularly through conflicts amplified by the use of various media. Firstly, the Samric Company and the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia fought over the designation of Boyd Theater's Art Deco interior with its Molly Palace style. The owners then opposed this measure as being unconstitutional, conflicting with the Fifth Amendment of the American Constitution. This interior was demolished. The 19th saw another conflict. Teacher insurance and annuity of America and New York City fought over the designation of the 4000 restaurant designed by Philip Johnson inside the Seagram building designed by Mies van der Rohe. In this case, current assumption regarding the status of designation interior, exclusively public until then, were questions. This interior was protected as one of the first modern interior landmark in USA. In Quebec, nearly 90% of the buildings designated and protected by the Ministère de la Culture include interior components. The protection of historic interiors was existed since the 20s, but it was not explicitly described then in the provincial law. Therefore, all of the first properties to be designated include their interiors. It should be noted that at the time, designations were essentially based on a historical and artistic relevance. For example, the church of Notre-Dame des Victoires was designated as a witness in the foundation of New France. In the 60s, interiors appeared for the first time, and its scope was also widened to include archaeological components. Another example is the designation of the EVOQ water mile for its architectural value, but also for the technical nature of its industrial mechanism. Protective measures further expanded in the 17th as interiors began to be designated in the entirety. This is the case with the Saint-Sulpice Library in Montreal. Finally, in the last 10 years, the provincial law gave municipalities the power to formally protect historic interiors, often implemented in close collaboration with the owners. Saint-André-de-Kamouraska was one of the first to take advantage to this role in protecting the interior of the lighthouse on les îles du Poix-le-Vie in collaboration with the organization that owns the building. Well, after this extensive context introduction, let's go to the heart of the topic. Historic interiors present several challenges that make them more vulnerable. Their accessibility, the raw and tear of the materials, the invasive transformations such as implementation of life and fire safety upgrades to meet current standards, and the remediation of hazardous materials, the significant impacts of improving the energy performance of the building envelope, the sparse existing documentation on these spaces, their very recent and conflicting protection, and the decline in use of real estate speculation that often leads to vacancy and dereliction. Whether to document, analyze, design, share, or question, all forms of media are available tools to help us to act as custodians, mediators, and influencers. Conservation initially requires as comprehensive documentation as possible. As previously mentioned, historic interiors are poorly documented. Archival research then becomes fundamental since the interiors and its evolution may have nonetheless been recorded in old photographs, films, documentary capsules, advertisements, etc., getting the planning of our intervention. For example, a recent project led by our firm was the rehabilitation of Maisonneuve Library, an old city hall of 1910. A large number of renovation in 16th and 17th altered part of the monumental interiors. A comprehensive documentation was made in order to restore them in keeping with the spirit of the place and the use, although not without some difficulty. For example, with these 2 or 3 old pictures found in archival, how can we ensure correct understanding of the original finishes, the texture and color? Fortunately, there are still a few heritage components hidden under the false ceiling of the 80s or covered with linoleum. The media of the archival was its limited, being frozen in the past. That's why physical witnesses are always the strong basic resource to proceed. But nowadays, we see the emergence of appealing new presentation technologies improving our practices. First, I will mention the Carleton Immersive Media Studio, a Carleton University research center in the Faculty of Engineering and Design in Ontario. The studio was built an international reputation, working with public, private, and non-profit partners. Over the past decade, it was being involved in 4 streams of inquiry: digitization, modeling, digitally assisted fabrication, and digitally assisted storytelling. Projects completed by the studio team enable process of documentation for restoration or rehabilitation of built heritage. One of them took place during the major restoration and rehabilitation project of the Parliament Hill National Historic Site in Ottawa. Various architectural firms took part in this project, which spanned several years. Our firm has notably participated in the phases relating to the center block and west block with envelope restoration and improvement, contemporary insertion, and interiors rehabilitation. Big works were done before and during the whole process in order to ensure an efficient transition between the various stakeholders, excellent practices in all interventions, and close and necessary corroboration. This documentation uses 360 degrees photographs and videos, building information models, and point cloud data from photogrammetry and laser scanning, giving with accuracy details, materiality, texture, colors, alteration, and transformation. With this documentation, an interactive tour was also designed to allow visitors to experience the art and architecture of 3 important rooms closed during the projects. In order to inform citizens and raise awareness of the heritage importance of Parliament Hill and the work undertaken to ensure its sustainability, a temporary installation was available, including 5 virtual reality stations that provide visual experiences of areas in the center block that are not generally available to the public. In Quebec, the government also has been supporting the development of digital technology in the arts and culture. Since the beginning of the pandemic last spring, many initiatives have also been put into place to stimulate digital transition, especially for archiving, documentation, and presenting content to a broad audience. Thus, several municipalities have used new technologies to develop their inventories. In order to show up their attraction, they now offer visitors and locals alike the opportunity to explore their built, religious, industrial, and landscape heritage from the comfort of their own homes. This is the case of the Appalachian region, which has just set up a virtual tour platform. This platform makes it possible to explore some 40 sites distributed in 19 municipalities, combining 2D panoramas, archival photos, written or narrated text, and audio recording. Let's continue our partnering on the virtualization of interior spaces as a presentation strategy. During last spring lockdown, a larger number of interior public spaces were closed. Several of them thus proposed virtual tours, a phenomenon readily advertised on social networks in which encourages to consume museum spaces and modern architectural works, amongst others, on house screens from home. In Quebec, in order to tackle the problem of vacant churches and closed churches during the lockdown, Nelson Boisvert, a geographer, proposed immersive experiences inside these places through virtual tours. He primarily considers that is as a way of preserving the memory and spirit of these churches, while developing a sense of belonging and recognition for Quebec's built heritage. However, as he himself points out, recording the visual memory of a building could result in a much more invasive and destructive rehabilitation, an intervention paradoxically allowed by very archival process. Then how can a historic interior that has lost its use be made permanent? And how can it be presented and referenced? This is an increasing topical issue. In fact, 2D immersion, virtual reality, and all of technologies cannot replace material components, and even less the experience you get from it. Nowadays, there is a real fascination for the object, that is to say, the use of new technologies, and to the detriment of the subject, that is to say, historic interiors and physical witnesses. We have too little insight of these new tools, the aging over time, perceptions of the next generation, and performance of data storage. So, how we could really manage the real subject. Often, when we're faced with an interior with rich historic features, the trend is towards modification. There are countless examples of this long-standing practice drawing on period rooms. However, modification through museology and therefore by analogy with displays also tends to reduce the space to a single perspective, that of having been. There is then a quest of attractiveness, a race for time, an obsession with keeping things as they are, and a constant monitoring for the signs associated with deterioration. A great example in Montreal is the Sir Georges Etienne Cartier House on Notre Dame Street in the Hall Center. Converted into a national museum, the institution proposed how to get acquainted with one of the main architects of the Confederation by having his place and his rooms reconstituted and animated by disguised guides. In addition, the museum offers tablets to visitors, allowing them to superimpose a series of historical photos and audio capsules in space through 3D immersion. If it proves necessary to preserve some examples for modification, this cannot be an economically viable option, and a significant conservation project caught in a nostalgic relationship, interiors become temporal showcased that can be visited for educational or even consuming proposed only. The goal is to provide the immense charm of living for the time of a visit in the minds of ghosts. However, the visit remains centered on a linear and often purely visual stroll. Limited to a passive spectator inside evocative spaces and virtual spaces, the visitor can only develop a superficial and temporary relationship with the latter. Yet, understanding heritage takes on its full meaning and coherence through a close relationship entertained by individuals who, as previously indicates, integrate and add onto its values and develop an attachment to it accordingly. The involvement of many communities therefore requires actively participation. In rehabilitation process, it therefore seems that more than relevant to think of new use, we facilitate recognition and therefore appropriation. And this requires active mediation, which means the in situ experience of the historic interiors. As said Véronique Côté, we are made of what we see, the place we go to, but also of what we are told. That's why we have to take care of the spaces where we live and also take care of the way we tell them. We end up being built like them. Beyond museum display and virtual experiences, how can we develop a different way of presenting historic interiors? It is a question of considering historic interiors not only as space to be visited, but as space to be lived in, and of seeking a balance between the potential for renewal and the identity and growth that they need. The consolidation of historic interiors through architectural conservation process seeks to rethink itself by going beyond the simple material perspective and by emphasizing the use value of the place. The immersive experience then addresses the historic interiors in all its complexity, highlighting an understanding that it's also sustained by sense, sounds, and texture. Let's take the example of the rehabilitation of the former head office of the Royal Bank of Canada in the Old Montreal. This huge building with monumental interiors was built just before the stock market crash of the 30s. It was Montreal's first skyscraper. And these interiors, from hall entrance to the bank lobby, offered an immersive experience, highlighting the richness and power of the institution. But the institution left the building, and the building was bought by a property developer who undertook its rehabilitation. But the bank lobby was left in use during more than 10 years and was punctually used in film shooting. The owner was waiting for sensitive adaptive reuse. Finally, the bank lobby was transformed into an office for tech startup and a cafe for freelance workers by local architect Henry Clange. Clange's brief was to create a space for both group collective employees and members of the public with a design that was contemporary and function, but sat well within the decorative surrounding. The design challenges originated from the requirements of owner and client, how to insert in an insensitive intervention in this monumental interior space, and how elaborate an architectural relationship and construct boundaries between the various program functions. The new intervention was meant to create a flow and possible interaction between permanent and temporary workers. A line of conference rooms is divided by internal partition and clad in bronze-plated steel to match the ornate detail of the height ceiling. These conference rooms subtly accommodate all the technologies such as telecommunication and electricity, preventing unfortunate squares in the historic components. The bank's marble floor, painting, plaster ceiling, and custom brass light fixture were all retained and restored. The open kitchen insert into the whole bank desk division. a great effort was being made to ensure the compatibility of the new intervention from the colors to the textures. The rehabilitation process is based on the use of the place, the active and immersive experience of workers and consumers with the special awareness of historic features and components. Compatibility was key to repurposing. Use compatibility, but also physical and memorial compatibilities, such as subordination and distinction, were respected guidelines, while experience of the place was involved and enriched by using it. Here are several other sensitive rehabilitation projects in Montreal on different scales and according to different strategies. Whether it is a historic farmers which has preserved the trace of its inhabitants, now used as offices, or a modern church which has lost its vocation, requiring substantial adaptations to accommodate a community kitchen, or an old scientific museum rehabilitated in the Center of Archival Conservation of Montreal. Thanks to an interpretation based on the informative and popular presentation of the place and its history, each rehabilitation could gain coherence and richness in its material and functional definition. The new architectural perspective, the interpretation process, would no longer be experienced by reading informative panels or through an immersive ritual visit, but through the comprehensive physical experience of the place and of its use. However, rehabilitation is not a simple avenue that works easily and every time, and there are several dangers that blur the line, such as the false discourses valuing intervention as heritage when they are not based on any heritage considerations. They are evocation, sometimes sublimated, pastiche, or false, but clearly not conservation projects. Or such as the blanching, completely smoothing all the interior components with a coat of white paint, thus losing all texture and identity. Well, in conclusion, I therefore believe that it is fundamental to change our paradigms and approaches. The conservation of historic interiors requires the development of a sense of belonging and pride in order to act better and ensure the durability in practice. And the citizens and the user must be at the heart of these actions because they are the first custodians of built heritage. Therefore, I would like to highlight the following points, which I think are crucial. The importance of renewed use of media, considering them as tools and supports in communication and documentation, rather than as an aid in itself. The importance of immersive experience in confrontation with material components in order to move from space to be visited to space to be lived in, and seeking a balance between the potential of renewal and the identity and core that historic interiors need. And finally, the importance of improving our strategies for collaborating and sharing in order to overcome competition and lack of knowledge. I will finish with 3 initiatives actively using medias and mediation in order to go in this way. First, the Heritage Montreal Fest Vive le Patrimoine, which is an annual event intended to be festive and informal in order to break down the boundaries between experts and citizens and make heritage alive by raising awareness and tackling substantive and concrete problems such as the conservation of interiors and the perpetuation of know-how in the public space. The non-profit organization Entanglements, which aims to respond to the problems of vacancy, increasing in the face of speculation in urban centers such as Montreal, through the implementation of transitional uses. And finally, the Franchir les Seuils initiative, which proposed to bring to light the potential role of historic interiors to remain identity and to ensure sustainable development of territories through interiors themselves, the expertise and the knowledge of architects, craftsmen and women, experts, institutions, and citizens. What is preserved and defined as historic interiors? How? By how? According to what discourses? The first part of the project begins with a field research across several countries in South America. And this project that I funded in 2019 led me to review the palimpsest concept in the field of historic interiors by the more complex concept of roughness. The roughness as a concept was invented by the Brazilian geologist Milton Santos as rugosidade to address the question of landscape and its analysis. Applied to interiors, it is no longer a question of seeing a superimposition of historical layers that can be read in watermarks. It is now a matter of thinking of the superimposed historic layers as components that influence each other, enrich each other, and complicate the final discourses, offering a cultural and natural blending of value and principle as proposed painting interiors of Indian churches. And this is necessarily physical witnesses. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mélissa, for providing such a incredibly broad overview of the status of the field, your context, both practical, the overview of theory, the overview of current tools and techniques and new media, really the entire package we needed to know. So I hope it also inspires some of the students to maybe even want to follow your footsteps. I'd like to invite now Filza Palma to start the questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mélissa, for being here today and like sharing with us your experience. And I find your French ESL program really inspiring. And about like you've been looking at preservation practices across countries with like varied cultural conditions. Like, can you share your experience about what you find as universal and what comes as a cultural divide?
The heritage conservation field is cultural and subjective process, like I said before. Therefore, each country's or cultural community has its own protection mechanism and values. But distinctive elements that I can highlight, I think, between the territories explored until now are maybe different approaches and perception of materiality concept as a main subject or intermediary to know-how and values. Maybe the government management also, sometimes up-down or bottom-up, sometimes linear or multidirectional, sometimes exclusively made as an architects and experts approach, and sometimes considered in close relationship with users and citizens. But that seems universal issue in my perception are the conflicts with interiors that I can see in all over countries that I see, and the fundamental importance of mediation to improve community pride and growing sense of belonging. Yeah.
Thank you. And I also, when you were talking about media and technology, and and you were talking about the Carleton University studio, and about the change in the forms of documentation from physical to digital, the act of digital copying is very different than copying by hand, like as it prompts one to think and inquire. Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, but as I say before, we have too little insight on the act of digital copying, the aging over time, perception of the next generations, and performance of data storage. Of course, this allows us to be faster, making us more demanding and impatient also in the production and sharing of information as well. But digital archiving are fast and extensive and allow us to go back quickly and make many trial and mistakes. However, understanding can sometimes be reduced, and the loss due to a faulty system or incorrect handling are considered considerable. During my first year of training as an interior designer in HED, we traced everything by hand on layers with squares and rulers. It was a long and hard job, yes, but I think the spatial understanding is much better today I sketch a lot before using digital tools. This refines our ability to observe the space that surrounded us in all its complexity. And personally, I never use digital perspectives in my work, preferring a hand sketch with its flaws and personalities than a computer-generated image proposing a reality in such perfection that it will never exist.
Kai, do I have time for one more question or not?
Yeah, yes, please. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay. So about the crossing the threshold program, the French lesson, I was really curious about like the financial stability of the whole program, and like how did you look for potential partners, and what was the whole process involved?
Well, Franchise refers to her responsibility as heritage communities to preserve historic interiors. And this initiative has been adopted and supported by a community of experts, architects, and craftsmen and women from Canada, and especially in Quebec. The stability of the first part of this project was based on shared financing between private players, such as EVOQ Architecture, public players, personal financing also, and crowdfunding, and architectural firms, property developers, heritage organizations, and associations are involved in the project. And each one brings a different kind of support, whether economic, material, or intellectual, to go away.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I see we have about a minute or so before the break, but I would just maybe a short question just to follow up on that. I'm just curious about your journey from head to Canada to specialization, and now coming back. Is there anything that you feel is to think about in that journey that you would reflect upon now, Mélissa? Oh, seems we lost her.